A Mind for All Seasons, written by me. It first appeared in The Philosopher's Magazine, and later was published in my collected works, What Don't You Know? So I'll be looking at materialism and common sense. So, what is the materialist view of the mind? Well, put perhaps in oversimplified terms, it is a view that the mind is the brain, or perhaps its functions, or whatever it might be, it's a purely physical system. Going along with this is, of course, denial of the immaterial mind. And you might recall from the past that materialism is a monist view, one type of stuff, and of course it's a view that this one type of stuff is purely physical. And kind of the opposing viewpoint is metaphysical dualism, in which there is an incorporeal mind and a physical body. And also, of course, idealism, which is there's just the mind. So the materialist view is fairly dominant today in both philosophy and science. But it runs up against what we might call the common sense view. Although with common sense, there's always a problem of, the famous quote, there's nothing common about sense. But in the common sense view, which is to say, if you were to go around and ask people who, haven't been corrupted by philosophy or who don't do like a lot of science, and you ask them, hey, does the brain have an important role in thinking and feeling and stuff? And they would say, yeah, definitely protect that brain, important. Then if you were to ask them, well, are you your brain? Do you have like a soul, or are you a soul or a spirit? And many people would think about it and say, yeah, I'm a soul or a spirit. And so in philosophical terms, the common sense view is that a person is a immaterial entity, soul, mind, or spirit. Now, for people who support materialism, their view is that the evidence for this materialism is overwhelming, that it would be, a mistake, perhaps even foolish, to embrace something as clearly untrue as, something like dualism, or worse, idealism. So how do materialists try to refute the common sense view? Well, one of the ways this is done is by using an argument by example. And you might recall, going back to the argument basics, how an argument by example works. And the idea is that when you make an argument by example, you advance as premises examples. And these examples are used to support a claim. And as you might recall from argument basics, again, the quality of an argument by example, which is an inductive argument, rests on the number of examples, the more the better, the relevance of the examples, the more relevant the better, the examples being identified and specific, that's a good thing, and also considering counterexamples, examples that go against the claim being made. So how does the argument by example go against common sense? Well, as you might imagine, to make this argument, you would present examples where common sense got it wrong. And then you draw the conclusion that common sense is unreliable. And then you'd go on, of course, to infer that because common sense is generally unreliable, you would also draw the conclusion that it's mistaken in this particular case, which would be another bit of inductive reasoning. So how is this done? What would be the examples? Well, common ones that are advanced would be the view of the causes of diseases. So kind of the, if you go back, in the past, kind of the common sense view is that, witches and demons and supernatural factors cause disease. Or they were like, the night air or something. So supernatural causes and, other causes. But of course now we know that those common sense views were mistaken. That the cause of disease is, what we call the germ theory of disease. Viruses, bacteria, fungi, microorganisms, etc. And so this is an example where common sense got it wrong. Another common example is the heliocentric versus geocentric view. That people often point to the failings of common sense by saying, back in the past, people believed that the Earth was the center of the solar system, but science has shown them to be wrong. So another flaw for common sense. And you can find others. Like, for example, They view the supposed that people thought the Earth was flat, and science has disproven this. And so the conclusion is, from all these examples, that common sense is unreliable, that it tends to get it wrong. Now, once we have that established, that common sense is unreliable, we can make the also inductive reasoning to infer that since it's wrong in so many other ways and unreliable, that it's probably mistaken about the mind. So, the next step would be an argument by elimination. The idea being that the only two possibilities would be materialism or having an immaterial mind, but the immaterial mind is clearly mistaken, therefore materialism is correct. So how could this be replied to? Well, a possible reply is this, that one could argue that common sense is generally reliable. So how could this be argued? Well, think about this. If most people were wrong most of the time, there would be more trouble. So what are examples of cases where common sense gets it right? Well, one would be that wood burns. That's confirmed, by science, and of course common sense tells us wood burns. Also, that ice cools. Common sense tells us this, and that's backed up by science. That sharp things can hurt and kill people is backed up by both common sense and science. That food and drink are needed for life are commonsensical views, but also supported by, science, seeming to be true. And we could go on all day with examples of how common sense gets things right. But it's not surprising, because if we were wrong most of the time, we would generally not make it. One could also point out that science itself has had its share of serious failures and mistakes, getting things wrong. In some cases falling to hoaxes, other cases, for example, advancing theories based primarily on prejudice and racism that are shown to be untrue, yet dominate science for a while. And so we can see that science itself also makes mistakes. Now, this is not to say that science is bad or ignore science. No, quite the opposite. It's that to point out that science is run by people make mistakes, and fortunately, though, the methods of both science and philosophy aim at trying to correct these mistakes. But the point here is that common sense often gets things right, science sometimes gets things wrong, and so we can't say that it's, by showing that common sense gets something mistaken, that therefore science must be definitely right about, there being a material mind. Now, we can't conclude from this that therefore common sense is definitely right about the mind. All we can say is that attacking common sense, saying it gets things wrong, doesn't prove that common sense is wrong about the mind. Similarly, saying that common sense gets a lot of things right doesn't prove that common sense is right about the mind. So at this point, it'd be neither established nor disconfirmed. Now, given that there is a widespread belief in the immaterial mind, again, it's kind of the common sense view, and you ask people, do they believe in a soul or spirit? Most people would say yes. So proponents of common sense say that a reasonable way to explain this belief is that it's true, that the mind is immaterial. To use kind of a silly analogy, a reasonable way to explain the widespread belief in trees is that trees, in fact, exist. So what materialists need to do, one might argue, is they need to provide an alternative explanation why so many people believe in the immaterial mind. Now, a fellow named Paul Bloom, a psychologist, advanced a Kantian argument, and Bloom's argument is this. Bloom contends that the mind-body distinction is an inherent part of thought, and this is, derived from our good dead friend Kant. We looked at Kant in earlier videos. And, distilling one of Kant's arguments down about the metaphysical self, Kant said roughly that although we have no empirical evidence for there being a metaphysical self, we just can't help but believe in it. We just, really want it to be true, and we just we just believe. Now, the materialist, of course, would reply, well, we believe in it until science sets us straight and corrects our mistaken belief. So the reason would be this. We believe in the immaterial mind because of the nature of, ironically or paradoxically, the material mind. That our material mind is set up in such a way that we just really want to believe that the material mind is immaterial. So this accounts for the belief in the immaterial mind without an immaterial mind existing. So how can one reply to this? Well, one reply is, running with this error view. So if one intrinsic part of thought is an error, then there are probably other defects as well. And this does provide good grounds for being skeptical about human reasoning, including science. Thus, given this defect, it's prudent to be rather skeptical of materialism. And so, kind of a turnabout on the argument that if we're wrong about stuff, then why should we believe we're right about this? And again, this doesn't prove that materialism is false or materialism is true, but it does, essentially kind of serve what Kant was doing. Kant says essentially we can't prove there's a metaphysical self, we can't prove there's God, but he contends essentially we can't disprove it, so it leaves room for believing it on some other grounds, which of course could be mistaken. Now, another classic argument against materialism is a moral argument. So here's how the moral argument goes. Materialism is alleged to be a threat to morality. One example we saw of this, in philosophy was our good dead friend Charles Berkeley. He made the argument if you believe in matter, that's a gateway drug into skepticism, which is a gateway into atheism, and that's, terrible. So we could look, back in history and, note that some people, claim that it was feared that the heliocentric view and its materialism would have dire and terrible consequences. And of course, their response would be, this worry was groundless. So there's no need to worry about a materialist view of the mind being a threat to morality, because past materialism triumphing has had no negative consequences. Now, the obvious reply is to argue that the materialist view of the world, the outer world, has had serious moral consequences. So as the material view of the world developed, so did the tendency to regard it as a mere commodity, to be used and destroyed at will. And we could argue by analogy, the same would also be true of the inner world. The more people regard other people as purely material mechanisms, more like being things, the more they will likely regard them as being things, to be used and exploited. This is not to say that people have treated people really well in the past, because they clearly haven't, but the last thing we need, one might argue, is another reason to treat people worse than we already do. Now, the moral argument, of course, is not decisive, because it's actually a fallacy to say that something has, bad moral consequences, therefore it's not true. True things could have terrible moral consequences. But it is a matter worth considering. So that takes us to the end of A Mind for All Seasons. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.